Well, as you would expect the 2021 Formula One season, given the way everything's gone, it was incredibly close and very, very even as practice got underway for the championship finale in Abu Dhabi on Friday. In the first session held in the afternoon local time, Lewis was slightly quicker initially out of the block on a new track layout. A lot of changes there. We'll get onto that in a minute, but it's a lot better than it used to be at Abu Dhabi. Much better racetrack. Slightly quicker than Max, but Max, having said that, wasn't happy with his car as he left the pit lane because the steering was slightly off. I think Mario Andretti probably would have come in after one lap because he couldn't do a lap unless the steering was absolutely right. That was how he felt the stagger in the car, man. But Max persevered for a few laps and said, look, I can't drive it like this. I've got to come in and straighten the steering. So his early lap times reflected that. Right at the end, they both ran fuel. Lewis was slightly quicker, but there were very few laps done. It didn't really mean much. And anyway, that session was held in ambient conditions, very different from those we can expect in qualifying in the race. So it was the afternoon session that really added up to where are we right now. And although you can look at the times on the internet now, and you've probably seen the headlines, first blood to Lewis or something like that, he was really quick on the soft tyre. And well, he's quick on the medium too, and the soft, point should be made. But when they got to fuel, when it really came down to crunch time, 20 minutes from the end of the second session, right in the zone when the race is going to be held, and they've got fuel in the car, it wasn't really a true face-off because Lewis did all of his laps on the medium tyre and Max did the bulk of his laps on the soft and switched to the medium right at the end. But let's just have a look at the lap times they did in that configuration. Lewis, 28.6, 28.7, very consistent. He'd do a few slow laps and then he'd put in a 28. Charles Leclerc was on the track right behind him and he was on average 3 to 4 tenths slower every lap. So it was interesting when Lewis backed off to do his 33 or whatever it was, Charles did the same thing as well. So yeah, Lewis getting a lot out of that medium tyre. He did a total of 12 laps on the medium, which for Lewis, doing homework on a Friday, it shows how diligently he's taking this weekend. No surprise there. Max did 8 laps on the soft and then went to the medium right at the end. But on the soft, it would have been a bit worrying for Mercedes, no question about that, because he was incredibly quick and incredibly consistent. Let me just read out his laps on the fuel soft tyre run. This is Max Verstappen in FP2, 28.1, 29.0, 28.4, 28.5, 28.7, 30.9, 28.7. Really good. And while that was going on, Lewis was out there on the medium, as I say, doing 29s. And it would have been, I don't know, slightly unsettling probably, but this is an example of how race teams have to just stay very focused on what they're doing. In the old Williams days, I used to pride myself on scanning the radio and listening to some of the other radio transmissions from some of the other teams, which was considered to be, you know, not the done thing. Although today, of course, everybody seems to listen to everybody else. So I don't know what all the fuss was about. And I often used to go to Patrick and say, oh, Patrick, you know, Michael's running this amount of fuel or that. And he'd say, I'm not interested. Focus on what we're doing. And he's right. You know, that's how you win Grand Prix. You don't get distracted. Although it's always kind of nice to know what everybody else is doing. And of course, it's important to know that Max was on a different tyre to Lewis when they did those all-important fuel runs. But I would say on fuel runs right now, Lewis looks pretty comfortable, but Mercedes will be thinking, are we that quick on the soft tyre? And anyway, how long is it going to run with a fuel load on board? But it'll be interesting because I'm assuming all the quick runners, certainly Max and Lewis, are going to qualify on the medium tyre in Q2 tomorrow on Saturday. And it's, how is the soft tyre going to come into play? I guess it's a backup thing if we need to go to the soft tyre at the end for whatever reason. Maybe they think they can get a lot of miles out of the soft tyre. We'll wait and see on that one. But let's just talk about what they did on light fuel loads when the new track had sort of found its groove and they were already getting into it. Basically, apart from Valtteri Bottas, who ran soft tyres this afternoon for both his light fuel runs, everybody else started on the medium tyre and then switched to the soft. So on the medium, Lewis did a 24.1 and Max a 24.9. And now I don't think that is the difference. I think that is traffic from Max's point of view. I don't think Max had a good run on light fuel on either the medium or the soft. And looking at the top speeds, almost identical. This is 2021, remember. Lewis 3.17, Max 3.16. And they're genuine terminal velocity things because look, there's Esteban Ocon, who was really quick today. He did a 25.1 on the medium, 320 kilometers an hour. So here we get to the build-up for qualifying tomorrow, Q3 if you like, because as I say, they'll probably be running the medium in Q2. Lewis on a new set of softs with the car now pretty much as he would like it. 319, still not massively quick in a straight line. They're running quite a lot of wing now, more wing than they were at some point of the session this morning. Lewis 23.6. Max 24.3. So big difference there. But again, top speed 319, 318. Not much difference. Valtteri did a 24.0 and Esteban Ocon a 24.0 as well in the Alpine. So if you're looking at Esteban Ocon doing a 24.0 and Max only a 24.3, well, you know Max has got a serious problem with traffic going on there. Although interestingly, Sergio Perez 24.4. Now he would normally be what, 0.3 slower than Max, I guess, around here. So you're looking at very even in terms of top speed. That's the first thing. And secondly, if you look at Lewis's speed on the light fuel run versus Max's speed on the heavy fuel run, and there are all different variables coming into play, and Max, as we said, was on a different tyre anyway on the heavy fuel run. But if you put those two factors together, incredibly close. Again, no surprise there at all. Good to see all the cars in Abu Dhabi. Good to see this new circuit. They've taken out a lot of the slow corners, and now we have some fast corners where it used to be very piff-paff, as the French say. And I guess the question has to be asked, well, why didn't they do this in the first place? Herman Tilke, please advise. Well, and it's not Herman Tilke that's done these revisions either. But the answer to that, just so everybody knows out there, and you may not have been around watching Formula One when all this was happening, but the remit from Bernie was a lot of slow corners, and they would probably sit down together and decide where these slow corners were going to be at every circuit, because that was part of the selling package of television, which Formula One controls, it produces, and on these strategically slow corners on every circuit, designed new circuit, if you like, new era circuit, there were going to be corners where the marketing team could go out and say, well, the camera is going to be in that position for that amount of time with that logo in the background because it's a slow corner and we're going to hold this. And then they can go out and sell to sponsors and say, you know, you're going to get this amount of exposure, track sponsors that is, this amount of exposure, you know, throughout the weekend. So that's why they did it. It was all for commercial advertising reasons. There was no thought about how good is the racing going to be? Is this an overtaking place? I guess in the back of everybody's mind, and this all started post Ayrton's accident in '94 when the whole super circuit era began. I guess the other thinking was the more slow corners we have and the more runoff area we have, the safer it's going to be. So where's the downside? And you can understand that, I think. And it worked, you know, it brought a lot of money into the sport. But now, interestingly, we're seeing these tight corners being removed and replaced by fast flowing corners, lots more opportunity to overtake, and all race drivers, as we said in last weekend, love fast corners anyway. So yeah, big improvement. And I guess that means Liberty are thinking, yeah, of course advertising on the circuit is very important, but equally the show is very important, and having opportunities to overtake and fast corners, fast flowing corners, has got to be better for the show anyway. So good to see that. I think I endorse that 100%. But it was interesting because there's now a very fast corner where there used to be some tight lefts and rights, but virtually impossible to overtake, unless you were Markelov in a Formula 2 car. I think he passed 13 cars in one weekend, we counted a few years ago. Anyway, it's now a banked corner, and it's not the first time we've seen these now, quite heavily cambered corner. We had one in Jeddah. And it's interesting to see how the drivers go round there, really, because there doesn't seem to be a geometrical apex. They just go in, it's a bit like the banking, and they just go in and they just use the camber all the way around. And it's not, the camber's not that great, but it's interesting that they do that. A bit like the hairpin at Suzuka, right? They never seem to hit an apex at there either, do they? So anyway, there were some interesting graphics. I think it's worth talking about those because they are, I mean, it's difficult to tell how fast. I think, you know, these graphics, I've got to say, I'm just sort of correcting myself as I speak here, but I think we've got to assume that they wouldn't be putting a graphic up unless it was a genuine comparison. In other words, it's not a driver on a slow lap and his teammate or whoever they're comparing him with on a fast lap. So on the basis that we, I think, have to assume that these are representative of what those two drivers are doing, the graphics actually make quite interesting reading and looking at, or observation anyway. I'm going to do my best to observe them. I mean, the most significant one was this morning, admittedly it was this morning, was Lewis against Max going into the hairpin. And they're approaching the hairpin now much faster. They just to tell you what they're doing, they go down the pit straight the same way, the left-hander's the same. But after that, it was always flat anyway through those S's. And those S's are still there and they're all flat, I think. Certainly whenever we were on board anybody, it always seemed to be flat. But instead of having that sort of very tight bottleneck before the hairpin that leads onto the back straight, they now have, it's now very open and they just go straight down into the hairpin. It's heavy braking, obviously, from about, well, I would imagine it's about 290 kilometers an hour, maybe 300 as they're approaching the hairpin. So it's quite a significant heavy braking area. And Lewis versus Max this morning, guess what? Lewis braking later than Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen braking earlier than Lewis Hamilton, whichever way you want to put it. So nothing unusual there. Lewis is braking later, stays on the brakes longer, and gets on the throttle later than Max. So Max, by contrast, is braking earlier, comes off the brakes sooner, and is on the power sooner. I think it's the time difference we have to be a little bit careful of, because that was only just one lap, I think. I don't think it was like a computation of laps. But that's the pattern for me that's interesting. And so here we have, again, Max Verstappen braking earlier than Lewis Hamilton, creating that very stable platform, and that is what he drives the corner with thereafter. Lewis, interestingly, yes, is braking later than Max, but he's staying on the brakes longer. And I think that, again, we have to be very careful of these graphics, because although you could assume it's just braking really hard and staying on the brakes longer than Max Verstappen, I suspect, I may be wrong here, but I suspect part of the braking that we're seeing on the graphic where Lewis is using the brakes is brakes when he's coming out of the brakes and he's already loading up the steering, and he's doing this beautiful transition of getting the front in, of decreasing brake pedal pressure against increased steering load. And I think that's why we're seeing Lewis on the brakes for much longer than Max. It's because he's using the brakes to get the front end in. Max does it by braking slightly earlier and just letting the car settle. Lewis does it by coming out of the brake pedal pressure at exactly the right rate. And which is better? You know, that's Christian Horner apparently last week said, oh, Max Verstappen is a better driver than Lewis Hamilton. You know, I saw that and I thought, really? I mean, it's one thing to believe that. It's another thing actually to say that in the position he's in. I've never known a team owner in the history of Formula One ever say something like that about a rival, particularly a rival who's won a multitude of world championships. And I'm not questioning here what Christian thinks about Max's talent. What I'm saying is I'm just astonished that he said that publicly, because I think that's very rude, actually, to say that about Lewis, that Max Verstappen is a better racing driver than Lewis. He may well be, but I don't think it's something that he's in a position to say. How does he know that? He's never even worked with Lewis Hamilton. A, and B, they're both very good. You know, in his position, in anybody's position in the sport right now, I think you'd be crazy not to say they're both brilliant. They're both very different in a number of areas, but they're both brilliant racing drivers. Anyway, I think just going on from that, I suspect, to give Christian the benefit of the doubt, I suspect somebody said to him, do you think Max will try and take Lewis out? Because if they're equal on points, of course, the championship goes to Max because he's won one more race. Do you think he'll try and take Lewis out? And he probably said, oh, he's a better racing driver than that. He can beat Lewis on the track. He probably said something like that, and it's probably been taken out of context, as is normally the case. Apart from that, everything pretty much is normal. The McLarens looked pretty good on occasions when they were more or less in sync with the rest of the grid, but they weren't doing that very often. Usually they were on softs, everyone was on mediums, or vice versa, long runs against light fuel. But both of them looked pretty good. Interesting to see Jack Aitken in George Russell's car this morning. He last drove that, I think, at that second Bahrain race when he crashed. And actually, as a result of that crash in the Williams, George got the puncture. Bearing in mind they're both teammates at ART in GP3, I think it was GP3 then. I can't imagine there was much conversation after that. But there he is again in George's car this morning, having just recovered from a massive shunt at Spa racing GT car. Anyway, he was slightly quicker than Nicholas Latifi, which is quite unusual, I think, for a stand-in driver just to get in and do a lap time like that. So he looked pretty good. Within a thousandth, and who knows what Latifi was doing at that point. But yeah, good job by Jack Aitken. And of course, the other thing is there's a lot of TV time this weekend for Alfa Romeo, because it's the last race, obviously, for Antonio Giovinazzi, who's being replaced by Guan Yu Zhou in next year, and also retirement now. I don't know about full retirement, semi-retirement, doing something else for Kimi Räikkönen, who'll be replaced, of course, by Valtteri Bottas next year at Alfa Romeo. I remember walking out of Yas Marina when the last time Kimi retired from Formula One. I followed him up the steps into the hotel there, and he just sort of had his head down, and people were sort of seeing him and turning around, there's Kimi. And he sort of had his head down and his bags. He looked a bit sad, really, I thought. And it reminds me, I don't know if I should end the video with this, but it reminds me of when he was at McLaren back in his heyday, when he was really quick. He was brilliantly quick, actually. We were in Brazil. It must have been the end of the year, because I think it was DC, I think, held some sort of end-of-year party, or paid for it probably. It was a nightclub in São Paulo. And it was I knew it was going to start at like 2 in the morning, so I went to bed, set the alarm for midnight, as you do, and got up and went along. And when I got there, of course, it was all quite seedy, because a lot of people had been there since 9 or 10 o'clock, and there was sort of gunge all over the floor, and it was this big sort of nightclub and the sort of walk around area on the first floor. So I went up there just sort of have a look down on what was going on. And Kimi was there looking over the fence, looking down at everybody, the railing. And it obviously had, a bit of lubrication. And so I sort of pulled up next to him and said, "Oh, hi, Kimi, how you doing?" He looked at me and, "How are you?" I said, "Oh, okay, well, how's it going?" And he didn't say anything. And then he just suddenly said, "I hate Formula One. I hate Formula One." And he just left. This is when he was at McLaren. So it's taken him quite a while to get it together to actually leave Formula One. Anyway, I love Kimi because, he's always just been his own man, isn't he? Completely on his own. And sometimes I've had brilliant conversations with him and had a lot of laughs with him. Other times it's just been, others just completely blanking, just get away. But, that's Kimster. And yeah, he's his last race. And to celebrate, he went off this morning, brought the yellows out. And this afternoon, I think about the same place, I may be wrong, but anyway, he did another of these and crashed into the wall. And he said something like, "Yes, I lost the back end." Yeah, we saw that, Kimi. And that brought the second session to a slightly premature close with the Reds. So he's had 2 big incidents already. I hope I hope he now has no more for the weekend. And we can say, Kimi, I reckon, drove brilliantly to finish 6th in his last Grand Prix, or whatever it is. Let's hope that happens. Unlikely, of course, I suspect, but it could happen. I think you've got to think about Valtteri as well. There's all this stuff about these 2 guys in their last races for Alpha, and in the case of Kimi, forever, probably in Formula One, and certainly in Giovinazzi for a while, probably. But you've got to think about Valtteri, because here he is, he's had a pretty good innings at Mercedes. Pretty good. And, he's won races, he's been quick, he's beaten Lewis on occasions. He's been really much the team player. He's definitely helped them win those Constructors' Championships. And this is his last race at Mercedes as well. And he's going to Alpha, he's going to a team at the moment that's at the back of the midfield. If that's the kindest description we can give it. High at the bottom, higher than the bottom, about quicker than Haas is about all you can say. And, I feel bad for him, really. So I don't think he's done that much wrong. I think he's just been a perfect number 2. And I'm still thinking about the decision that Toto took to, to replace him. I can only imagine it was a massive amount of pressure and reading a lot of the media who are all saying, is Bottas quick enough? George Russell. George is fabulous. I've always been a fan of George. And in fact, it was at this race a few years ago when I interviewed him in the GP3 paddock, just after he'd driven the Force India Formula One car in the first session, and then rushed back to the GP3 and blitzed the GP3 as well. I mean, not many drivers do that. Not many drivers like to go from an F1 car back to GP3 or vice versa, but he did it without any problem at all. George is mega like that. But, he's going to be a serious problem for Lewis in a number of ways. Not necessarily going to be blindingly much quicker, but his way of operating and all the aura around George is going to definitely change the balance within Mercedes. Anyway, that's another video for the winter, I think, probably. The only other bit of news, of course, is that Mercedes have now taken off that sponsor, Kingspan, from the car. We talked about that at the Jeddah weekend. And all I can say is, ridiculous not to have done their homework on that, to do a deal with a sponsor and then take it off the car and finish the relationship purely because Mercedes didn't do their homework. It doesn't reflect very well on them, actually, for that, I think. Anyway, I don't know if that's a very good way to finish this video, but there's so much going on in Formula One, it's kind of difficult to know that this is the specific point at which we should get on and see what happens tomorrow. But we got to the end, I guess. So let's see what happens tomorrow. I'll see you then.